but having it there for people in the future to be able to look at where did this information come from so they could go look it up if they're interested. I thought that was important to do, even took a lot of time and a lot of effort.
So this second text, I'm going to guess that because of the growth of the NATA and all the regional conferences, that the information is going to be exponential. I mean, is that sunk in yet? Of given the growth that we've experienced in the last 50 years, how much work this next one will be compared to the first one, or are you willing to take that on? Or
it's yeah, I know it's going to be a ton of work, and I've been gathering resources and looking at things. One of the things that will be easier is that there's a lot more written down that in fairly easily accessible places. It just, I mean, there's literally thousands and I look over here, on my shelves over here and my shelves over here, and I probably have 10,000 pages of stuff to go through. And then I still have probably 15 boxes of stuff to go through at the national office in Dallas, and I have tons of stuff to go through still at Kramer, and there's a number of different libraries that have some archives and different things that I have to go through. So it's a massive amount of material, but at least for the most part, it's going to be easier to find it than it was for the first part, because you kind of have some repositories and you have some things to go through. That's what I'm working on now, is to actually look, and I'm trying to sell some books to raise some money to do some more travel back to Dallas and Gardner and several different libraries all across the country that have stuff to sit down and go.
Oh, looks like he's still there, right? All right, Matt, so if you can hear us, we dropped you again. So hopefully you'll come back in. All right, so Skype is trying to regain the call at this point.
All right.
There we go. I don't think we missed. I know you said you were trying to raise some funds for the second book by selling the first book, so fully understand.
Yeah, I'm actually going to do a little crowdfunding thing here in next month to try to raise some money to see. The book hasn't sold as well as I'd like it. Of course, that probably would be true even if it sold a lot of books, but I've sold less than 400, so I'm trying to sell some more books to raise some money. I've got to go to San Jose, California. They have one of the sources from a lot of information for the NATA was written on in the 1950s before the NATA put out its journal. They're the closest ones, so I got to go there. I've got to spend probably a week or two in Dallas. I've got to spend a week in Gardner. There's stuff at Purdue. There's different, so there's a lot of different places I need to go, and so I'm going to try to sell books and raise some money and see if I can raise enough money to finish off some of this research. And as I find stuff, I make digital copies of pretty much everything and keep it. Hopefully one of these days all that stuff is going to be sitting in the NAT archives, so some poor fool who tries to go do a lot of research on athletic training history can go there instead of trot all around the country and do what I've had to do. So make it easier on people in the future.
Interesting to hear the amount of work it takes behind the scenes just to put a book out.
Yeah, well, yeah, it was. I knew it was going to be a lot of research. I just didn't realize it was going to be as much. I just didn't realize I was going to find as much, especially in the early times that I found. And even the stuff as we get up into more modern times in the 50s, 60s, 70s, there's even more material there than I thought there would be. So it's a lot of stuff to go through. It's a lot of reading, which is okay. I don't mind doing that. And I can go through that fairly quickly, getting that stuff because you're not actually, you have an idea of kind of where stuff is. So it's going to be different from the first one. Still a lot of work. Once I get to do the travel and get all those resources together, it's still probably going to take me a couple of years to actually go through all the stuff and write it.
All right, so you may have answered this partly earlier, but why do you feel it is important for us to look back as athletic trainers and understand our history? I mean, obviously, you just said you spent a good bit of money and time doing this work, and why do you think it's important for us to, read your book or to look back and to know where we came from?
Well, a couple of things. One is more philosophical. As a profession, you really need to have an identity, to kind of bring your profession together. Who are we? And so it really helps with that. I believe it helps a lot. Wow, we've got a pretty long history. It's a longer history than most other allied health professions have. And to see, how we became athletic trainers and even the term and the things that we do, how they came about. And so that's helpful. I think from an individual standpoint, the history, as you look at the practices that they used through these different eras, it can give you a longer look at your own practice, where you can take and say, something new comes out, so you go, you know what, that's really not as new as we think. We've tried that before, and sometimes things work, sometimes they fail. And so we can look at our own practice and our own techniques and things that we use and give a longer look, and have other people's experiences help our own, whereas we don't have a lot of times as much anymore the longtime mentors that were really common in the profession in the 50s and 60s and 70s. We've changed our education. We don't have quite so much anymore, and so the history kind of fills in some of that gap too, where it's not just my practice that I'm basing my decisions on, but the practices of others over a century and a quarter or so.
I think it's interesting. And I remember, I think it was last year on the podcast, Dr. Knobloch talked about how things have kind of changed, or we've gotten away from things that we used to do, but now we're kind of realizing, hey, those were good things and these things aren't. And I think we were talking about training. I can't remember, but like the weight training. So now we're training to be bigger, stronger, faster. I could be wrong. Was that kind of?
I don't remember it, but keep talking and maybe it'll click.
Yeah, I don't know. That's the thing. We've done a lot of things, and so I just found it interesting that you said that it's more or less the same, and that the good practices that we started with are kind of emerging back, because you're on Twitter, I'm on Twitter, and it just seems like there's a constant, oh, well, here's a new way to do this, here's a better way to do this, here, train this faster or harder or smarter or
I think
easier.
There's a lot of fads, essentially,
Yeah.
where, take this supplement, you'll lose the weight, and we find out it just doesn't work.
Right.
Or,
Sure.
put this magnet on your shoulder, it'll heal your shoulder, when we know that therapeutic modalities and rest are going to be, by far, much shown superior results. But I think, based on what you're saying, I think, the conversation I remember when we were talking about the classic things that we know and use every day, ice and heat and stretching, are going to always work over some magic pill or something, and I'm sure that's been shown historically as well. Ice has been around. I remember taping aspirin to it from the 50s and 60s, and I think the Raiders football coach was Al Davis, or the owner was saying that, just taping aspirin to it. But I think that's what's interesting about this book, is we see what worked back then, and just like Matt said, some of the things back then were standard that now we're looking at it as like, what were you thinking? Well, the only way we know that is because research shows what's best. And then, and just like he also mentioned, what are we going to be doing in 50 years? What are we going to be thinking in 50 years about what we're currently doing? Could you imagine? Can you imagine the standard practices we have now, that in 2050 they're going to be saying, what in the world were we doing that for? And it's interesting to think, because we're probably doing something that it is eventually going to be looked at as ridiculous. So I think that's interesting about the book, as we look back at the 50s and 40s and 50s and we saw what they did then. Now we're going to look in the future and say, what is it we're currently doing? It's going to have those same responses to us. So, but that's what research is for, and that's how science improves itself. So.
Yeah. the history, if you read it, I mean, uh, the quackery involved sometimes, is somewhat astounding that people, oh yeah, and again, it's not. A lot of times we think of quackery as people, duping someone, but the people they honestly believe that this
Yeah.
is going to work. I mean, and then there's people trying to make money off of it, and then there's this and that, and all these things. You can see it all, in the history. I mean, it's all there, and you can start to see the patterns and things, and hopefully, if you learn your history, you'll be able to identify that a little bit easier and prevent your own practice from adopting some of those things. But it is hard. There's new things. Well, does this actually work? Does it not work? When do I adopt it or not adopt it? All those things, and the history will help you do that. One thing about the weight training, it kind of reminded me of a story. There was in late 1800s that an athletic trainer was actually having his football players, it was at Harvard, work with weights to build strength. And he got fired because it was seen as a bad practice. And so it takes time for things to be adopted, and the what over the test of time and research, we get better.
So tell us a couple other stories about interesting things that you've learned. I mean, an athletic trainer using weights seems ridiculous for them to get fired. So what other things are like shocking or very interesting that you may have in your book?
Well, you know, they we kind of have a feeling that people weren't using ice for acute injuries, until much later than they actually were. There were people actually recommending using ice or cooling, not necessarily ice because it was a little hard to get sometimes, even in the 1800s. It didn't catch on. Mike Martin with the Washington Senators in baseball was using ice for acute injuries as far back as the 1920s. And they were, and it grew and grew by the time we get into the World War II era. Ice is actually getting to be a much more common modality to use than a lot of times what we've been led to believe. So we can see that they still used a lot of heat. In the beginning when Dr. Billick, who wasn't Dr. Billick at the time, he didn't have his MD yet, started to write his book in 1917. They talked about hydrotherapy, which actually a lot of times is just anything that used anything water, and I mean literally they would play a hose on a person, with a nozzle jet on it. The whirlpools didn't start to come out till around the 1930s, and use it kind of as a form of massage with hot and cold water. So you start to see some of that stuff, and that was pretty fascinating. Just seeing some of the changes that have been made. It's really hard to go through and try to follow all the changes. And in my book, I picked a couple different injuries just to look at, how the change. Looked at ankle injuries, looked at concussions. How have we changed over the years to in our treatment of those? Kind of give an example of something you can follow along, but all the treatments changed, and there were some things. If you look back on my website, athletictraininghistory.com, in the resources, you can actually go back out and download Samuel Billick's. Actually, it's the second edition. I don't think the first edition actually exists anywhere. I've been looking all over, but on how to treat injuries and what kind of things that you would find. And we don't deal a lot with athletes with diphtheria and some of these other things that we find. One of the recommendations from, they were always worried about constipation, that was really bad, and it kind of goes back to the old humoral theory. and not that constipation is good, but they were really worried about it. And one of the things that athletic trainers learned to use is warm water enemas, which is I'm glad we don't do anymore. But it was it was a real concern in the early days. But it was a concern from medicine. It wasn't just athletic trainers going off on their own with this. Physicians are going, oh, that's really really bad. You have to have that. Of course, some of their diets were not conducive to regular bowel movements too at the time. Especially if you lived in some of the cities, you might not get fresh vegetables and those types of things. So, it's a different world. When athletic training started, it's a much different world than what we live in. Think about a world with no cars, no electricity, no telephones, no television, no radio, no plastic, and think about how you're going to do your job. And so it was a lot different.
You said something that was interesting to me is on the History Channel they had a show, Modern Marvels. They talked about the history of the power tool, and one thing was really fascinating or interesting is that they had the technology invented back in the 30s, but they didn't have anywhere to use it because power outlets were not standard. And so it makes me think that, even at the time of having these whirlpools and the ice machine, that I'm sure most of the therapy in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s was probably manual therapy and maybe heat, because that's all they had access to.
Well, yeah, you would have a lot of manual therapy. You would have some, they used water and various means of doing it. I think you would have, as you would get into the early 1900s, start using like heat lamps. They used diathermy fairly early. That was as you get into the 20s and 30s. That was a big modality they used. Actually, muscle stimulation goes back to the 1700s.
Wow.
Although you would use a battery. I have sitting right over here
All right, so we lost him again for a second. So I'm assuming he's going to be talking about the stim machine. There you go. You back now?
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm here. It's the muscle stim. Like I say, they started using that. They didn't. It was kind of like magic. They didn't really know if and how it worked, but it was like, oh, wow, that's got to be good. So they had what they called medical batteries, and they had those for a long, long time. So we see some of that come out. I just doing some research, saw some stuff on who was it? Duke Wire from Maryland. There was a report that in the early 50s that he was one of the first college athletic trainers to use ultrasound. So these modalities would start to come about. Again, some of them for a lot longer than we thought. Especially muscle stim really surprised me when I went and did the research on that and all the different kind of machines that they made. Again, they didn't know the background of exactly, theoretically why it should or should not work, but they had it and they sometimes used it. So.
All right, so you were talking, as we move towards evidence-based practices with the NATA and those kind of things, you were talking about not having cars and obviously not internet and those kind of things. How did athletic trainers learn what to do best if we weren't having these conventions or Twitter or podcasts, webinars? How did they learn that?
Well, it was experimental. It was well, let's try this. Let's see if it works. A lot of it, obviously, the placebo effect is a powerful effect. And so if you're giving someone a rub down and if they think it works, then it's probably going to help them out some. But giving the rub down, it'd be awful hard to fake an injury or hide it if someone's rubbing hard on it. So there could be some good things about that. But they learn through experience. They learn from others. Basically it was all internship stuff. And then as time went on, we get Samuel Billick starts his what becomes the Trainer's Bible. He writes 9 editions from 1917 to 1956, and so that starts to spread that knowledge some. The Kramers were real important with establishing the first aider in 1932, which was sent to all the schools all over the country, high schools and colleges, where people started to share their techniques and their experiences, which is a real. It's important for a profession to do that. And as the athletic training profession developed, the first aider really started to encourage people to share their stuff because people were kind of keeping their stuff secret, because it was kind of like, I don't want to share it because it kind of give my team a disadvantage if everyone knows this stuff. But it kind of gave people some publicity and things if they shared it. And so they began sharing their stuff, which helps lead to our profession, and then, we start to see more stuff shared in some other things like the Athletic Journal, and finally in 1956 the NATA starts to produce its own journal, sharing information. And there was actually some people doing some research. Dr. Wilbur Baum, who was an athletic trainer at Washington State and then later with the Redskins and some other professional teams, both baseball and football, did some research at very basic stuff, published it in the 1940s. I have a couple of his things that he published, a couple of those, I don't really want to call them books because they're really more almost mimeographed, maybe 40, 50 pages. There's 2 of them that he produced on research that he'd done, but he'd done some research trying to figure out, what's the best thing to do. And so we did start doing some research earlier. One of the things that kind of gets us is that we really didn't have a lot of physicians interested in sports medicine or athletic medicine. There were very few of them at the time. Augustus Thorndike starts producing a book. He was a physician from Harvard in the 1930s. We don't see physicians organized in sports medicine until the mid 1950s. So that takes that piece of it, having the help from the physician community, doesn't really start to occur really until the 1950s and 60s. So we were kind of on our own to try to figure stuff out.
Did you see you had one?
No.
All right, so I've been reading a little bit. We talk about how things change. I read just recently, I think it's Chip Kelly with the Eagles is doing all this technology where they have heart rate monitors and weigh-ins and sweat monitors and all this stuff, and then the athletic trainers are making like personalized shakes and that kind of thing. I mean, you can only imagine how they used to just take a guess and see how it works, and now we're using all this all this biofeedback right away. So I'm wondering, how are you kind of keeping track of all that stuff for your 2000 to present book or whatever?
Well, you go back and what I'm taking a look at is obviously I look at kind of what's published and where. One of the things I'm trying to figure out how to do, I haven't quite grasped the technique of figuring it out, is looking at, like in the journal, the NAT journal, of what was advertised and how long did it last. Because you see the fads and stuff come and go, and and trying to figure out a way to use advertisements to figure that out. Because if people are using it, wanting it, there'll be advertisement for us. When did they first come out? When do you see them fade away for different things? And then looking at textbooks, one thing it's nice, I mean, in athletic training, what I'm using for the most part are some texts. Sam Billick's Trainer's Bible, the 9 editions of that go to 56, from 1917 to 1956. And so you can kind of see how that changed. And then in, I think it was 63, Clausen Arnheim comes out. And that's still, the modern techniques of athletic training that, well, what's that? It's changed names a few times, but now it's in like the 15th edition. It's still coming out. So you can use that to start to look, how did things change just, looking at those two texts. You can see a lot how things changed. And then obviously there's a lot more other texts. As we get into the 1950s, there starts to be a lot more books and things published on athletic training, and so you get a more wide array. You can't track everything. I mean, someone may want to do research on the history of the use of something in athletic training, go back and look. I mean, I can't track everything. I mean, it's just become too wide of a topic. So again, I pick a couple injuries and a couple things, and I highlight those, in how they've changed over time, and treatment methods and modalities and those types of things. Now, one thing you did say, you talk about, doing weights and stuff. They were weighing athletes and looking for changes in weight in athletes in the 1800s. They were doing that. That was actually one of the big things they were worried about, is what they called staleness. But it was people becoming overworked, fatigued, those types of things, and they were using weight, scales, to try to determine that. Although they wouldn't let them drink water during practice. So you gotta wonder what was going on there. But they would look at that stuff. They would use the technology they had the best they could, and that's what we're doing and trying to figure out, how does it fit. Does it fit? Does it actually work? I mean, we've come out with all kinds of new technologies that people have used, and a lot of them haven't worked. They just haven't been effective. But people, oh, it's new. It's got to work. We'll use it. And then they spend money on stuff and do stuff, and then it turns out, after 5-10 years, and it's gone. Something.
So one of the things you hear about in the current I guess it's in discussions, is how media has made the incidence of injury much more prevalent. So in your experience, back in the in the 20s and 30s, obviously they had deaths occur in sports and everything. I believe it was President Roosevelt actually wanted the sport of football to be canceled. What did you find in injury rates or even death in athletics, or related to athletic training, or the helping maybe spur the need for athletic training? Did you come across that kind of research that shows that really there isn't that much of a change? It's just that now social media makes it seem much more prevalent than it really is. But did you notice, were injury rates the same back then? Were they more prevalent? What did you find on that?
Well, one of the I did find some statistics from the early times, and I include a lot of them in the book. But it's really hard to compare them if you're going to say, well, are knee injury rates up or down, compared to 100 years ago? You just can't use the statistics to compare them, because their idea of what was an injury and what was the severity and those types of things were much different. When first, when they're talking about, give me an example of knee injuries, you never heard of any, the cruciates. They didn't talk about them. Well, there wasn't anything to do about it, and it wasn't until the 1930s, it was Thorndike's book in 36, I think, when they first started talking about, well, you can do this drawer sign thing in the knee. But then if you found that, oh, well, it looks like the cruciate torn, they didn't have anything to do about it. They put a brace on it. That's about all they could do.
So you just found out if it's torn or not, then you live with it. Sounds like.
Yeah. And so trying to compare the statistics is difficult. There were a lot of deaths early in football, and the exact number is difficult to pin down. Different sources would have different numbers. There was no control over it. What was a death caused by football? Well, if in some cases, someone went home after playing football and they died of anything. They didn't know what they died of. Well, that was a football death.
Mm.
Or, I mean, obviously, time before antibiotics, you get a cut and it gets infected and you die. Then, well, that's a football death. And so they didn't have really even the vocabulary to define exactly what they were talking about, to use it to be able to compare to today's uh, sources. Really, athletic trainers became important because of the physicality of football. But really, when it started, it was more what was happening. They had student coaches, they were over conditioning them, and they wouldn't play very well. And that's really why athletic trainers started uh, doing conditioning, to take it away from these student coaches um, doing the conditioning, and so they wouldn't become, as they would call it, stale, basically overworked. And then as athletic trainers started to do this, because again they were mostly track coaches of some type or another, and they knew some conditioning, but then they started again, probably almost instantly. As soon as they started working with football, they started to deal with injuries, because football has a lot of injuries, and their job was to get the team on the field in the best condition possible. So you would treat injuries and make your own pads and all that stuff, and they made all kinds of stuff. It was pretty amazing, the stuff that they came up with, preventative things and protective things and that kind of stuff. But that it just naturally evolved from that. Again, not coming from the medical standpoint necessarily, but it's getting the team on the field, which getting a team on the field and being able to do that is, if you're working in athletics, that's still an important thing to be able to do.
Mm-hmm.
So.
All right, so you said you spent a good bit of time in the Kramer archives. What are some of the products there that are just like shocking or amazing, or I don't know, just some really cool stuff that you saw there dealing with products that we used and don't use anymore, or even the same thing that we used back in the 1800s that we use now?
Well, as far as the Kramer archives go, I mean, they still actually make a lot of this stuff. I mean, they've changed the formulations of it, but they're what they call their legacy products. Things like Kramer Jezik or a Skin Lube or Tough Skin. I mean, that stuff existed for quite some time. Kramer started making liniment. Chuck Kramer was a pharmacist, and he actually kind of made his own liniment, which was they commonly used liniments in those days, and he made his own, and that's kind of how the company started. He was working at a drugstore, and actually while he was in college, and he sprained his ankle. He was a pharmacy student. He made his own liniment, and then he just kept making it and improving it. And that's really how Kramer started in 1918. They didn't start making other products till about 1930. And some of again, the same products that they made, they still make up some of them, not a lot, you know, but it's changed. It just need to kind of see some of the old stuff. They would use tannic acid a lot for treating athlete's foot and trying to prevent it and treat it and do those types of things. And one thing about Kramer is, because again, Chuck Kramer was a registered pharmacist, they did some things different and more scientific than a lot of other companies did at the time, and they were focused on sports medicine, the first company that did that. But they would send things out to the University of Kansas for analysis, in their chemistry department and things like that. And they would do some of their own analysis. They had their own lab right there. They would do stuff. So that was kind of one of the bigger changes that happened. They started to apply some science to stuff. Again, some of the things that they did, the salt tablets and all that stuff, it wasn't right, but they thought it was right at the time. I mean, it was common in the medical literature that you're working out in the heat, take a lot of salt tablets. That was just the standard of practice of the day. So it wasn't Kramer saying take salt tablets. It was medicine, and they would then develop stuff, and they kind of still do that today. They develop things based on what athletic trainers want. I mean, they're a company; they sell stuff, and they want to sell you things that you want to use. And so if you say, well, we like this, they're probably going to make it, you to some extent. So you see that, and so, but you see more science being applied over time, again, which helps us do it better.
Mhm.
You're talking about the products that Kramer started putting out. When did taping start really kicking in? Because that's something we do every day now, just about. Is when did taping come in, and what did we use before tape? As far as
Well, taping started, and I can't remember the year. It's like in the 1880s, with name just fled from my mind. It'll come to me. But a physician started to tape ankles. They used what they called adhesive plaster at the time. That's what we would call tape. There wasn't athletic tape as we know it until 1899. But he started to use it. Virgil Gibney it was Dr. Virgil Gibney, and the Gibney basket weave technique is still around.
Wow.
And it was in the 1880s. He published some stuff in the early 1890s. Again, on my website, there's some information on taping and the history of that, and obviously some in the book. Athletic trainers started to use tape probably in the 1890s. Michael Murphy invented a lot of taping techniques that some we still use, the thumb spica and some of those things. And they would tape anything. I mean, literally tape. If it was hurt, throw some tape on it. Originally, the adhesive plaster would come in basically rolls. It had a backing on it. You would have to heat it up sometimes to get the backing off or to get the tape off of the skin. And you would have to, it would come in wide sheets and you'd have to cut it. I mean, I have some stuff over, here that some of the old 12-inch wide sheets with the backing on it, all on the roll, and you would have to cut strips and do those kinds of things to do it. Then obviously, it starts to come in rolls. They say in 1899, Johnson & Johnson invents the zinc oxide-based cloth tape that we're familiar with. Obviously, it's changed a little bit over time, but it was athletic tape, and that starts to come out, and people start to use that. So there are all kinds of taping techniques. By the early 1900s, taping is common. It's very common. And again, the techniques used, and there have been improvement in the adhesive on the tape, and all kinds of stuff like that. But it was one of the earliest things that we kind of still do today.
All right. Well, you got anything else for us?
Well, buy a book.
All right. So
Buy a book so we can get a second one out of you.
Yeah, buy a book.
What, you said your website was athletictraininghistory.com?
Yes, and I have a Facebook page and a Twitter account. So you can follow those. The Facebook, I try to post just a photo of something every day. It's more just a visual thing, and try to sell books. I actually have a few T-shirts that I made that I'm trying to get rid of too. So if you like a T-shirt, you can buy one of those too.
And the link to the book is on your website, I'm certain, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And if you go on the Facebook page, you scroll down, there'll be different things saying buy a book, buy a T-shirt. So I'm using it as advertising too. So education and advertising. Like I say, starting next month, I'm going to do a crowdfunding thing to try to see if I can raise some money to take some trips and try to get this thing. I'm kind of stuck with the materials that I have. I have to go do some more research before I can really move forward in it. I've got a lot of resources, but I don't know exactly what I'm looking for yet, because you kind of see what threads you're going to use looking at the history, because there's so much stuff, you got to pare it down some.
We'll have to make 2 books out of this next one.
I hope not, but I might. But with 550 some pages in the first one, how much athletic training history people want to read.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to do all the basic research, and then what I'll probably do after I get all that done is just sit down and write a shorter text of all of it without all the notes and sources and stuff, so people who don't want to do all that reading can actually uh, get a basic idea of our history, something that maybe uses a text in the colleges and things like that. But I have to do all the research first before I feel comfortable doing that. I could probably throw something together, but I could throw something together right now on the NATA history, but I don't want to throw it together. I want to do all the research and do it right and have that for the future where there's a good documented history so people can go back and use that.
All right, well, Matt, I had mentioned possibly a discount code, and you said you were going to try and
Well,
get some.
I've tried to use that in my Square account. There's a discount code, and everyone who tried it before, it didn't work. And so I don't know what. Tell you what I'll do is I'll put on my Facebook page. I'll go and change the price into my Square account for it. It's not going to come off of the regular website. You have to get off the Facebook account. I'll go give a $5 discount for about a week or so.
Awesome.
All right, so there you go. So a sports medicine broadcast exclusive discount if you go to his Facebook page. Which is public to anybody. So
I'll go do that, and I'll probably be up here in about 20, 30 minutes, after we're done. So.
All right, very cool. So I'll send out a message, a tweet there saying some exclusive from the sports medicine broadcast, and then so hopefully it helps you sell some books so you can keep producing some more history for us, because it'll be fun for 10, 20, 30 years to find out how much stuff we're doing now that was the same, and then how much stuff is just totally off.
Sure. It's interesting. It's neat to know kind of where you come from, and there's actually a lot of stuff that we should be very proud of in our history. A lot of people did a lot of work to get us to where we're at.
Mm-hmm.
This thing just didn't happen. We've come a long, long, long way, and then that's exciting, and we just keep making progress. And it's good. It's really a wonderful profession, and you get to help people and you get to meet all kinds of neat people. Athletic trainers are some of the best people in the world, so it's a lot of fun, and it's like I say, I think we should be proud of our profession. There's a lot of work done to get us to where we're at, and a lot more work to be done. We got to buckle down. All of us working together and get more done. So.
Very cool. Maybe next time we'll have to do a video tour of your place, because you kept referencing different old school athletic training items and we couldn't see them. So
I'd have to clean up a little bit. It's just a bedroom here in the apartment. It's just got stuff all over the place. So, but I do. I try to get out. Every once in a while to different places, and I have an old Kramer trunk that they sold at one time. They didn't make it. They just stuck their thing on it, and I load all my stuff in it and take it to, when I go do presentations. So, maybe one of these days I'll do a little tour around the country and bring all my stuff and stop at different places and show it to students and people. So, yeah, we'll see.
Be fun to see all the different things at one of our workshops or something. So.
Yep.
It's fun stuff, It's all the old stuff is kind of cool, so it's fun to mess with and play with and touch.
And electrocute yourself. So.
Well, I haven't actually, because hang on. Let's see if we can see this. This is that's the old medical battery, the muscle stem. it would take a dry cell battery, and I haven't gone to get one to see. I only have like one of the electrodes. I have to make one, but I haven't had the guts to try it. So and I don't think I will. But it, it's a Tesla coil, and it's pretty basic. It's not all that complicated.
And in normal fashion, it's huge.
Yeah, and actually, it's fairly light, but it's in a nice wood box. I've got to reattach the lid to it. I got to figure that out. The lid's come off, so I got to see if I can get some period screws or something and put the lid back on it. But yeah, it's just, and this was actually made for home use. So,
wow.
But they would use them, they would use them in some athletic training rooms, or physicians would use them, whatever. So that's kind of interesting.
Very cool. Well, if you were back in Dallas, and Houston's about 4 hours away, so maybe we could meet up. I can have you come down here, and we could do an in-person interview instead of on Skype or something. You never know. Or maybe you can meet up.
I've been to a couple places, do presentations in Texas, but mostly the western part, so because that's a little bit closer. But yeah, if I get back to Dallas, I'll let you know, and maybe we can do something. Bring all my toys, and we can sit there and show them off.
All right, very cool. Well, then I'm gonna close it out here. So we want to thank people that helped make this possible. GHAT sponsors the CEU opportunities, so you can get BOC approved CEUs for being part of the webinar. Now, just the podcast, you can't, so you can enrich your knowledge, but you can't get the CEUs unless you join the webinars. And if you have feedback on that, times and things like that, then let me know, and when we can see what else we can work out. Of course, U of H Masters of Athletic Training Program, Dr. Mark Knobloch, and U of H Masters of Athletic Training Program student Matt Barnes for coming in, throwing in some good comments and questions, and really just helping us all around. So hopefully we'll see more of Matt Barnes and some of the other Masters of Athletic Training students, along with Dr. Yellen and Dr. Knobloch. Again, our website is sportsmedicinebroadcast.com. Almost every Wednesday you can watch live. You can join the conversation by all the links that are on there. Twitter is PHS SportsMed, using hashtag DSMB during the live show. We can kind of track your comments. Sports Medicine Broadcast on Google Plus and Facebook.com/PHS Athletic Training. So for Jeremy, the Sports Medicine crew.
Mark Knobloch at the University of Houston.
Matt Barnes, University of Houston.
And Matt Weber on Skype with athletictraininghistory.com. That's a wrap. All right. Well, Mr. Weber, that'll pretty much do it.
Well, thanks.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Yeah. All righty. Well, I'll be talking to you guys later.
All right.
Good luck with textbook number 2.
Yeah, well, I'm working. Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Very nice. I love your setup here. You even expanded it since what, July we were here.
Yeah, at the end of the school year.